And he was just simply saying, look, Dawkins and co, they got it wrong. It's actually, you can't simply ignore the way that Christianity gave us a foundation.
Welcome back to the show that loves doubters. Today, Bobby speaks with Justin Brierley. Justin is a UK broadcaster, writer, and speaker who hosted the Unbelievable Show and Ask NT Wright Anything podcast for many years. He currently hosts the Re-Enchanting Podcast and a newly launched documentary podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Now, Justin's latest book is also called The Surprising Rebirth of the Belief of God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. Now, this is the topic of conversation today. Bobby and Justin, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Justin, it is so good to see you again. And thank you for joining us on Christianity Still Makes Sense.
Thank you so much, Bobby. It's so good to see you. It's been too long, and I'm hoping to actually be with you in person at some point in the not too distant future.
Well, I would love that. Every time, I've got to be in your presence, it's just a joy. And I'm just so thankful for how God is using you and has used you. And I know he will continue to use you. When I think about the way, Justin, that you have been used, and we're going to talk about your book that's coming out and how exciting it is to see, in a lot of ways, this crumbling of the new atheism movement. And yet, a lot of these people are your friends. I mean, you've modeled for us so well that it's possible to have good conversations with people. And I'm just so thankful. So when you think about all the years you did with Unbelievable and what's up next, how do you feel like the tide has changed with the new atheism movement from the time you began till now? And maybe start off by defining the new atheism.
Yeah. Well, it's been an absolute privilege to kind of be a bystander and a contributor in a lot of these conversations. And I hosted the Unbelievable Show for over 17 years, really from those early times, really, of the new atheism, when it was really at its height. The new atheism you could define as a kind of very anti-theistic, quite caustic and in some ways a really I think abusive is probably over the top, but wasn't afraid to use ridicule to kind of cast its aspersions and criticisms of Christianity in the church. And it was led by some well-known names, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. These were the sort of people that are often associated as the four horsemen of the new atheism. It was a movement that essentially was about rallying atheists together against the forces of religion, against Christianity. And it had some, I guess, high water marks in the UK. For instance, there was an atheist bus campaign around 2008, 2009, proclaiming there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life, circulating on London buses. Over on your side of the pond in the US, there was the Reason Rally in 2012, where tens of thousands of skeptics and atheists descended on Washington, D.C., to champion science and reason and so on. So it was this kind of really interesting time when God was being talked about in really open ways, which was obviously a good thing. But obviously the tone of the conversation wasn't always great, because it was often done in this very dismissive, almost arrogant way, towards the claims of faith. So I was fascinated to be, hosting conversations, debates with some of these, leading people from the new atheist movement opposite amazing Christian thinkers. But yeah, it did change over the years that I was doing the show. And to some extent, the beginning of the book that I've written is kind of charting the rise and fall of the new atheism and how the conversation did actually end up changing in the last several years.
Yeah, I mean, and the conversations that you had, it was just so fascinating for me just to listen. And just, again, I love the way you moderated. And I think all Christians did for the most part, except for maybe Mark Driscoll. for those that remember.
Yeah, there's an interesting episode in the archives. If anyone can stomach it, to go and listen to me and Mark Driscoll going at it together.
Oh man, yeah. But I just finished up C.S. Lewis, and God in the Dock, and he has this statement in there I thought was, really apropos to what you're talking about. He said, there's no use going around attacking each other's psychological states about what they believe. That doesn't help the argument advance. We need to get down to, really what is true and why we really believe it, instead of, making people feel, ashamed because of their beliefs. And I think you really did a great job of modeling, let's not attack the psychological state. So why do you think this is happening in the culture today, where you're seeing a reduction of these new atheists, and where are the eyes being opened? And why do you think the atheism worldview is unsustainable, Justin?
Well, I think new atheism, as I say, kind of had its heyday in those sort of late 2000s, early 2010s. And to some extent, what I witnessed was the movement kind of running out of steam to some extent. So I think I started to notice it when increasingly, when atheists were coming on my show, they were often actually distancing themselves from the new atheist movement. They were often saying things like, well, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, because I think the movement itself came to have a certain kind of almost quasi-religious status itself. It became very invested in, scientific materialism as the only explanation for life and the universe and everything. And if you, dared to question, or move outside of that orthodoxy almost, you were rounded on as a heretic. So I can think of a well-known philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who published a book called Mind and Cosmos, where he kind of dared to suggest there might be some kind of purpose or meaning in the universe. And the new atheist, leaders really rounded on him because he was going outside of the bounds of what was their kind of orthodoxy, effectively. So I think to some extent, people started to see that it was taking on an almost religious nature. I think it also suffered a lot of internal problems. To some extent, as soon as the new atheists had agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, they couldn't really agree on anything else. And the movement fractured and splintered into lots of different warring factions over issues like, women's rights and LGBT rights and that kind of thing. There was a movement that wanted to push in the direction of being atheism plus. So plus, a commitment to all these kinds of issues, whereas others felt that this was just, ideologically driven. This wasn't what atheism was about. It's just about, non-belief in God and reason and science. And they felt that this was all getting too politically correct and went off in the other direction. And really, I think that was the start of the undoing of the movement, because by the end of that period, when they were having these infighting kind of moments, the controversies and the fallouts, and to the point where some of these atheist leaders were unwilling to share stages anymore, just meant that the whole movement started to suffer in that way. And on top of that, I think it just, in the end, a lot of people just moved on. They realized the new atheism wasn't really, once it had said its thing, it didn't have much else to offer. And so it kind of, I think the steam kind of went out of the movement in that way.
Yeah, it's very obvious. And it's, it's a reminder that sometimes something can seem like it's gaining such traction in the culture, and it can implode. And I think even as we're sitting across the pond from you, we're seeing some of kind of the flags you're putting up about, let's slow this whole process down on transgenderism. And, we're just going, all in over here. And you just see that maybe some of these things that seem so strong, like the world's changing, they die out. And here's Christianity. It's stuck around. And I think about Jana Harmon. We were in the same PhD program together at the University of Birmingham. And I know that, she loves your program, and you know her as well. But in her research, she discovered, after interviewing 100 former atheists that became believers, that 54% of them found that their worldview under atheism was unsatisfactory, yet they still held on to what they believed to be the truth, even though they did not believe there was anything sustainable about it. So with that thought in mind, and changing over now to your book, tell us a little bit about your book, because I think that what you're going to want to say in that book is, hey, this isn't a satisfying worldview on new atheism, and people are onto that. And so tell us what it's called and why you decided to write it and what people can get out of it.
Well, the book is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. The subtitle is Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. And essentially, the book is really, it's encapsulated in that subtitle. It's talking about that rise and fall of new atheism, but the way in which the conversation really changed, so that the audience that were with the new atheists, I think, transferred to a new set of secular intellectual thinkers, but ones who were taking Christianity far more seriously. I think these new thinkers realized that new atheism hadn't delivered answers for people's ultimate questions around meaning and purpose and identity. And so you started to see, as the sort of the Dawkins and the Hitchens and the Harris and so on, their kind of star began to wane, if you like. You saw the rise of people like Jordan Peterson, again, who's not a Christian, but very well-known secular psychologist, and filling, auditoriums with 3-hour lectures on the Book of Genesis, for goodness sake. I mean, and these were secular people that he was kind of attracting to these things. And you've got to ask, well, where did that come from? And my contention is simply that people like Peterson became well known and drew these great audiences because people were looking still for purpose and meaning. That kind of God-shaped hole had not been filled by new atheism, and the church isn't always a great place or does a great job at actually addressing the sort of the secular needs. And so what I've increasingly been seeing is people like Peterson and many others I could mention who are kind of almost secular prophets from outside the church, but who are showing us what's going on in our culture, that there is this search for meaning, for purpose, for identity, and that the things that people are currently seeking to try and fill that void with, the kind of trying to create stories to make sense of life for themselves, they're just not doing the job. You mentioned transgenderism, it's a good example, I think, of where we're seeing a real drive in our culture for people to kind of make sense of who they are through a specific kind of identity. But very often it just creates more confusion and more sort of, competition and controversy in culture than actually producing a kind of good outcome. And for me, it's symptomatic of the way people need something to live for. They need some kind of identity, but they're often looking in the wrong places. And what I found fascinating about a lot of these thinkers that I was starting to bump into was that they were taking the Christian story seriously again. They weren't dismissing it like the new atheists were. They were saying, well, I don't believe, but it turns out that Christianity probably is responsible for all the moral values we hold in the West. That's the point of view of someone like Tom Holland, who's a well-known popular historian here in the UK and has this tremendously well listened to podcast around the world called The Rest is History. And he came to the conclusion as a secular person that Christianity was what had given us all our virtues and values in the West. And he was just simply saying, look, Dawkins and co, they got it wrong. It's actually, you can't simply ignore the way that Christianity gave us a foundation. So as I was hearing more of these voices, secular voices, but far more sympathetic to a Christian worldview and the value of Christianity, it just made me wonder what's happening. Maybe there's something new happening. And yeah, I guess I just put that all under this title of the surprising rebirth of belief in God.
Hi, Tim here. If you are enjoying this conversation and want more episodes like this one, please let us know in the comments of this video on our YouTube channel. While you're there, you can also like this video, you can subscribe to our channel, because it is a great way to support this ministry. We are a listener-supported ministry, and if you feel led to support this show with a financial gift, you can do so at ChristianityStillMakesSense.com and click on Donate. Now, back to the conversation with Justin.
I love the title of the book, Justin. With 17 years, you have interviewed the most well-known atheists in the world and Christians. I said when we interviewed you on Pastor's Perspective, I wouldn't be surprised if you're the most well-networked Christian apologist in the world. You have got so many connections. You're one of these guys. You're just so gracious to everybody, too, Justin. I've never heard a bad comment about you, except again from Mark Driscoll. He kind of messed your record up and reminded us that, okay, Justin is a sinner. But my question, Justin, for you, did you ever have a season of doubt? At Christianity Still Makes Sense. I went through a season where I literally thought I was going to be an apostate, and that was scary. And that was happening while 1 Minute Apologist was growing, and I was pastoring a large church. I was just encountering all these arguments, and the doubt was so overwhelming. I ended up in counseling, antidepressants, had a relapse. I feel like at times in my life, I've said before, I'm sure there are people out there, but I've never met a person that I would say has been hammered more by doubts. Yet I don't I hated my doubts. I didn't want to become a progressive
Mm,
Christian. I'm glad that God helped
mm,
me to come through that. I'm
mm.
just curious, like with you, do you feel like you had any like shows where you're just like, maybe we got it wrong here? And what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, I definitely had, I think there was firstly a season of doubt really well before my broadcasting career began when I was still at university. And I
Mhm.
think that was just at the point where I was starting to discover this thing that I later came to call Christian apologetics, because I was confronted by, really intelligent people around me who were basically questioning my faith. And I hadn't really grown up in an environment where I'd had a really good grounding in kind of,
Mm.
the evidence for Christianity and that kind of thing. So, but, I did discover at that point, C.S. Lewis and others, and that was really helpful. But I think you're absolutely right that when I kind of stepped into the lion's den with the Unbelievable Show, and for 17 years I basically brought on all manner of very cogent
Oh,
skeptics and atheists and agnostics, and said, okay, let's test this thing. Does Christianity work? And all credit to the Unbelievable listeners, because they got on board too, and they went on that ride too. And in all honesty, I can say that there were definitely some shows, some periods where I was like, wow, I'm not sure quite how to make sense of this one, because
yeah.
Bart Ehrman just came on, and I just read his book or something, and yeah, that's really tough. I'm not quite sure
Sure.
how my guest. What I found in the big scheme of things, though, was that I was able to start to put together kind of my own case for faith. And while I absolutely didn't claim to have an answer for every question that is out there, and every mystery, I came to see that ultimately you've kind of got to choose where you're going to put your faith, because if you don't put it in Christianity, you will put it in something else. And
That's right.
the main contender for that among a lot of the guests that I was meeting was something called atheist naturalism. It was the idea that this is all there is, that the universe can ultimately be explained as a complex set of physical interactions, matter in motion, the laws of nature. And the problem for me, when I finally kind of put all the pieces together in my head, was that there are far more gaps in that story of reality than the story of Christianity. It's not that I can show you, prove everything in the Christian worldview, but it makes far more of a coherent sense of the whole picture for me than the atheist naturalist view of reality. So I just found that Christianity made better sense of things in the end. And I guess I just found my peace with those things that ultimately we may never know this side of eternity, and that kind of thing. What I did find was that at the core of it, there was an intellectually credible historical core to Christianity, and a person whose influence and beauty you simply cannot deny. And for me, that was enough, that I was like, Jesus works, and I'm
Yes.
happy to kind of stay here, and it's the best thing going as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, for me, when I was in the midst of it, I suppose agnosticism would have seemed like the most appealing because I could just sit in critics' corner and just be like, yeah, but then I came to the conclusion as I would think about like, oh, if I was to walk away from this, then what would be, the set of questions or potential doubts that I would inherit that are
Mm,
unforeseen to me right now. So I would just try to put the hat on and go, okay, so I'm a Muslim. What am I bothered by? So I'm an atheist. What am I bothered by? So the atheists, obviously they're going to, come at us hard on the fact that there's suffering in the world. Yet on Christianity, at least there's, ultimate justice. They might want justice now, but there's ultimate justice.
mm,
Whereas on atheism, there is no ultimate justice. So I just
yeah,
would start kind of just putting the pieces together. And I thought even on agnosticism, the agnostic would concede that there is an explanation. You just can't know it. So I thought I'd rather give my life to the best explanation. And I think that's what you've done. And I think your book, Justin, is really going to show just the lasting standing power, of the Christian faith. How can your book play a role in the local church today?
well, I'm hoping that anyone who picks up this new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, it'll help to guide them through what the questions are that people are actually asking today. Sometimes I think we can get a bit stuck in the questions of yesterday. And to some extent,
That's
as
true.
much as it's really important to have questions to those answers to those fundamental questions, like does God exist, and what about the problem of evil, and how do we know the Bible is true? Those were questions that were more, I think, in a sense, being prompted by the new atheism, because they were going for a full frontal attack on those kinds of issues.
Good point.
I think now, actually the kinds of questions that the average non-Christian person is asking are less kind of specifically, does God exist, but more kind of, how do I make sense of my life? How do I, have a reason to get up in the morning? And that's what these new thinkers have been tapping into. They've recognized that there's basically a meaning crisis in the West, that the new atheism failed to deliver answers to people's sense of who am I, what am I here for, what's my purpose. And people like Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, Douglas Murray, a number of these sort of new thinkers who are not specifically Christians, but are very much sort of understand how much the Christian worldview gave people that sense of meaning and purpose. They're in a very interesting way sending people back. They're a kind of gateway almost to people taking Christianity seriously again, and asking themselves, well, maybe this might be the thing that solves this sense of who am I and what am I here for. And so for me, the value for the church is to kind of look at the questions that are actually going on in your community around you, maybe be more attuned as to the kind of stories people are telling themselves today. Because in fact, I don't think the new atheism made that many converts to this kind of strict materialist naturalism. Most people today, I think, still would describe themselves as sort of, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. Okay. They've said no to kind of institutional religion, but they might still pray occasionally, and they might still kind of engage in some esoteric new age practice, or they might even be into the occult. People usually are not kind of completely closed off to the idea of something more, something transcendent. And the question for the church is, how do we speak into that desire? How do we actually engage with that in a helpful, meaningful way that shows people that the story they're really looking for is the big story, the story of Christianity. So I'm hoping that in various ways, as I tease that out through various individuals and themes in the book, that it'll help churches and Christians to kind of help to tell their story more effectively to people.
Yeah, and no doubt it will, Justin. And I think too, as it relates to, contextualizing, what you're talking about, this is where relationships are going to be important. In fact, Jana Harmon, in her research, says that 82% of the people that were former atheists that did convert over had, a positive relationship with a Christian. So that's significant. She's talking to 100 former atheists. 82% of them say it was having a connection and a good relationship with a Christian that I saw something different in. And, just coming back from doing a conference with, Frank Turk's CIA and a whole slew of apologists. Well, we were listening to some of the emerging apologists, and you can see what you're saying happening so much. And I think it's for the good, where you would just hear the students come to give preparations, and they would talk, is the New Testament reliable, the cosmological argument? And it's like you start wondering, how many times do we have to repackage this? And what you saw this time, I know it's contested, but at least somebody was dealing with the topic, the Enneagram. Somebody else came and presented on PTSD and trauma and how it affects the brain, and how we have to have an apologetic of mental health. Transgenderism was a discussion, not trusting your feelings. And so here we're beginning to see that I think apologists might be getting their head out of the sand a little bit. And maybe one of the dangers that scared so many people away on a broader scale is you had these new atheists, and they're making us feel so stupid for believing. And then, like you said, we're reacting with the best of science, but that only grabs at a limited amount of people. Now I think we can really do a catch-all to show the importance of apologetics. What do you think about that, Justin?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think there is still a value, obviously, to that kind of more classical apologetics,
Sure,
where it is about the arguments and evidence. But I mean, one of the things that I think was really helpful for me in writing this book was crystallizing the thought that probably apologetics at its best is actually a twofold approach. And it's almost like a left and right brain approach. You know how
100%.
They say your left side of your brain is kind of that more logical, analytical, kind of picking things apart type of part of your mindset, and the right hand side of the brain, again talking generally, is that sort of more artistic, imaginative, kind of seeing the big picture kind of thing. And I think we sometimes treat apologetics as though it's just the left brain. It's just, giving people facts and evidence and arguments, and that's going to do the job. That's only half, or probably less than half actually, of how most people are wired. And what you need to actually appeal to, I think in the first instance is the imagination of someone. You've got
Mm-hmm.
to kind of make them realize why they would want this to be true. And I think that's where you know, I use the metaphor in the book a lot of people's story, and the fact that people want to see themselves as living in a story. And that's why people are telling themselves so many stories today about identity and purpose and who they are. And it's this kind of very pick and mix approach, you know, where I kind of invent my identity from scratch almost. And when you can help them to see that what they're really looking for is a story that's already exists, that has given meaning and purpose to generations and millennia, you know, over a couple of millennia to all kinds of people. And the question is, why would I want that story instead of the story I'm living in right now? And I think what you have to do is help them to see how that story makes sense of their story. And that can be done in all kinds of ways. I mean, C.S. Lewis was a master of showing
Sure
people
was.
why they wanted Christianity to be true. He created a world called Narnia, which, you know, everyone has probably tapped the back of a wardrobe just in case there might be a magical land of fauns and castles and, you know, knights there. But he said, what if this world with this king called Aslan, what if it actually were true? What if there really was a world of adventure and valor and bravery and ultimate meaning and love and purpose? And he made people want that world to be true. And he said, well, guess what? It is true. There is such a thing in our world. And for me, that's really important, is to kind of stimulate people's imagination, show them why they would want this story to be true, and then do the left brain bit, which is also important, of showing that it is true. There are good reasons to trust Jesus really did walk
That's
and
right.
talk and came back to life, and that there is a God who, you know, makes sense of the universe and everything else. But I think if you only do the latter, it's harder for people to get there because they're not as invested in it. So I've got some suggestions in the book about how the church can go on that imaginative journey with people as well.
Yeah, that's really good, Justin. I mean, I feel like that's my wiring, left and right brain. And a lot of times, if I'm with just pure apologists, I feel like, well, you know, I'm a little bit maybe eccentric, and I love all the kind of the art side and the right brain. But then if I'm with just kind of, you know, the right brain folks, I want logic and reasoning. And so maybe I feel like, sadly, sometimes the professors are considered the left brain and the pastors are considered the right brain. And so the church is lacking in doctrine and the professors might be lacking in creative ways to do it. And then you find someone like Lewis, who obviously was an anomaly, and he was criticized even by his own dons for the way that he lived his life. Well, as we think about, you know, wrapping up the show, I just want to tell our audience that on today, Christianity Still Makes Sense, is the great Justin Brierley. And just love Justin. And he has written another book called Unbelievable. If you haven't read that, pick it up. It really was an amazing read. I loved it. And I can't wait for your book to come out on Audible, because I am going to be listening to that for sure. And I'm just so thankful for your ministry, Justin. As we wrap up, is there anything that you feel like we shouldn't leave on the table? Anything that you would like to say to the audience in our final few minutes?
I guess I just want to say, I hope this new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, gives people hope and a bit of optimism. I think we've kind of gone through a few years now in the church of a lot of negativity, a lot of stories of, you know, falls from grace, scandals, toxicity. There's been a kind of almost a reckoning, especially in the evangelical church. And I think that's, in some ways, that stuff has to happen. Sometimes God has to shake things up and prune dead stuff for new life to blossom. What I hope this book gives people hope for, though, is that God is not finished with the church. The church has been through
So
a
good.
series over the last 2,000 years of deaths and rebirths of different kinds. And I feel like we're going through one of those now. But that on the other side of it, God's purposes will be fulfilled. And there are a lot of people, I think, who are going to be coming in on the tide of the kind of the forgotten hopes and lost dreams of atheism, which just didn't answer their questions. And I think people are maybe ready to hear this story afresh. And the question is, will the church be ready to receive those kind of refugees from this meaning crisis that the West is in? I hope that we will, and I hope that the book helps people to do that.
That's fantastic, Justin. I think it's with Tyndale, correct?
That's correct, yeah, and it releases on September the 12th, but you can pre-order it from my website right now at justinbrierley.com.
That's great. Yeah, my book is coming out in April with Tyndale, and I try to hit on it in the topic that we're talking about a little bit. Does Christianity still make sense? Because I think that's what people are asking. Does it still make sense? And so I try to do an apologetic, but it's a little bit of kind of biography, kind of how a near apostate answers today's biggest objections. Because there are things about Christianity that I concede that don't make sense, like Ezekiel laying on a side for 390 days and then flipping over and giving God another 40 days. Chiropractor, anyone. But Justin, thank you so much, buddy. We really appreciate you and can't wait to see you in person. Until next time, peace out, my friend.
Thank you so much, Bobby. Great to talk with you.
If you found yourself unable to trust after your experience with new atheists, I would invite you to watch this episode of Making Sense of Scripture. We'll see you next time.